power is not granted, it is taken, shaped, and imposed upon the world. Those who refuse its weight are doomed to be consumed by it. Observational fragment recovered from the Biotan campaign. As the thunder of the Unification Wars drew to a close, Terra stood trembling on the very threshold of rebirth, with one final fire remaining to be quenched. It burned rather stubbornly in the southeastern sprawl of what ancient cartographers called the Beltan lowland. It was here at around 798 M30 that the Emperor of Mankind turned his gaze towards a nation that had long resisted his dominion, Beota, a relic of the Age of Strife. Beota had survived on martial tradition and arcane governance. Insulated by its rugged terrain and fiercely loyal population, the ruling dynasty had remained obstinate in the face of Terra's reformation and reunification, refusing to yield their sovereignty even as the stars began to awaken to the Emperor's call. The Imperium's patience, already stretched thin due to centuries of conflict, had reached its end, and what followed would be the final, decisive hammer blow of the Unification War. The 15th Legion, recently forged and still untested on the broader warfront, was then deployed to crush Beota's resistance. These warriors, soon to be known as the Thousand Sons, were not yet the arcane masters that they would one day be, but even in these early days, they bore the marks of brilliance. As the Imperial army moved to engage the outer territories, it was the Astartes of the 15th who descended upon the heart of Beotan in a lightning campaign that would leave Imperial historians stunned for centuries to come. 6 weeks, that is all it took. In less than 2 lunar cycles, the Yeseti dynasty had been extinguished. The Botan military apparatus, ritualistic, stubborn, and hopelessly outdated, was dismantled with precise finality. Every act of defiance was met with a calculated measure of force. Every stronghold was breached with surgical speed. For the 15th Legion, this was not simply a campaign, it was a proving ground, and they emerged from it not only victorious, but transformed. The successful pacification of Beota marked a turning point. Shortly after the smoke cleared, the Emperor himself bestowed upon the Legion its enduring name, the Thousand Sons. It was a title born of both distinction and a grim omen. Its origin actually was tied, as we've previously established, to the strange numerical beginnings of the Legion's formation. From there, the newly appointed Thousand Sons were granted their own expeditionary fleet, and they were summarily dispatched into the stars, as the era of the Great Crusade had truly begun, and with it the next chapter in the Legion's evolution. It was 5 standard years into the Great Crusade, and the 15th Legion, the recently named Thousand Sons, stood as paragons of imperial progress. What began as promising martial formations soon revealed themselves to have rather defining characteristics that would elevate and ultimately imperil the very Legion. A widespread and escalating emergence of psychic phenomena. Initially, these powers were viewed with cautious optimisms, as the Thousand Sons believed their gift to be a reflection of the Emperor's own example. His mastery over the Immaterium mirrored in their genetic inheritance. Though apparently reluctant, the Emperor permitted their use of these abilities, recognizing the strategic utility in the ever-expanding war for galactic reunification. As long as the results benefited the Imperium, discretion was granted, and the results themselves were undeniable. Rather than engaging in prolonged sieges and attritional warfare, the Thousand Sons waged a war of the mind. Entire planetary populations were subdued through manipulation and thought. Psychic coercion, along with warp-born illusions, were also tools in the repertoire. In many cases, compliance was achieved with minimal to no bloodshed. But this method of conquest was so at odds with the doctrines of the other legions, to the point it drew ire from traditionalists. Chief amongst them was Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, whose contempt for subtlety and sorcery had already been well documented. To Russ, there was no honor in conquest without battle, no glory without the clash of steel. The Thousand Sons, in his eyes, walked a path devoid of a warrior's virtue. Yet it was not external condemnation that brought crisis to the Legion. Rather, it was a transformation from within. Without warning, members of the Legion began to undergo grotesque and horrifying mutations. These weren't physical aberrations, but catastrophic reconfigurations of the Astartes' very forms. Limbs twisted into monstrous shape, flesh sheathed with unnatural growth, minds unraveled and unmade. The Thousand Sons came to know this condition as the flesh change. At first, it was isolated and sporadic, with the cases being uncommon enough that they could quarantine and safely study them, but it spread at a terrifying, nigh incalculable speed, as entire squads, then companies, would succumb. Those affected were either put down or placed in stasis, sealed in hopes of an eventual cure being found. In a matter of years, the Thousand Sons numbers had once again plummeted to that of near extinction. Then salvation would arrive from the stars. The Great Crusade reached the remote world of Prospero, where the Legion was at last reunited with their long-lost gene-sire, Magnus the Red. Upon his arrival, the flesh change had already reached pandemic levels, yet Magnus, prodigious and powerful, acted swiftly, employing methods and knowledge never previously recorded or even known to the current Imperial archives, as he intervened directly, halting the mutations and purging the instability, preserving what remained of his sons. The cost, however, was staggering. When the process concluded, only 1,000 warriors remained. The name Thousand Sons, once symbolic, had for a second time become quite literal. With their gene seeds stabilized, Magnus turned Prospero into a haven for psychic study and began the process of recruitment and reconstruction. Though their numbers were never able to match those of the larger legions, the Thousand Sons returned to the galaxy with their strength restored in both flesh and mind, ready for the Great Crusade. And with Magnus at their helm, they did not just conquer, they transformed. Entire systems were brought into Imperial compliance, not through devastation, but through domination of will and vision. Where others raised cities from rubble, the Thousand Sons preserved, instructed, and enlightened. As the Great Crusade surged onwards into the darker frontiers of the galaxy, the Thousand Sons adapted their strategy with calculated precision, and where brutal force failed, the 15th Legion relied on cunning manipulation and their unparalleled mastery of the immaterium. Diplomacy, psychological warfare, and illusions born from psychic powers became the foundation of much of their success. In the early campaigns, this approach was tolerated and perhaps even admired by the broader Imperium, but this tolerance would not last. When expeditionary fleets of the Thousand Sons pushed into the lawless voids, they encountered enemies unlike any others, Xenos and human creatures alike, who wielded psychic forces in defiance of Imperial sanction and allotments. In these new and uncharted theaters, deception alone could not secure compliance, and war was inevitable, leading the Thousand Sons, ever adaptive, to meet war with militarized sorcery. Where others raised bolter and blade, they summoned storms of fire and rent thought from flesh, bending the very warp to their will. Worlds fell to compliance or into oblivion beneath the relentless weight of their psychic might. But with every such victory came renewed levels of scrutiny. Rumblings of discontent began to circle amongst the Primarchs. To some, these psyker legionaries were not warriors, but rather liabilities. As a silent question grew louder, said question was as follows: should such power be allowed to persist within the Emperor's legions? However, this question found no immediate answer, but events soon rendered the quest for an answer unavoidable. The Xenocide of Kamikina Troika was fought in the late 900s of M30, and it stands as one of the Thousand Sons' most brutal campaigns. The system had been overrun by orcs who were brutal, feral, and utterly unrelenting. The Emperor himself issued a writ of complete extermination, mobilizing not only the 15th, but also a colossal series of god engines from Legio Astrum and the genetically augmented infantry of the Pan-Pac Eugaeans, and their objective was beyond simple to surmise: purge the greenskins from the triad of satellite worlds orbiting Kameka Uzilra, a vital holding claimed by the Mechanicum of Mars. This war, despite its scale, lasted but a mere 2 standard years, and it was a campaign not of glory, but of attrition. Every inch of ground was earned with fire, blood, and psychic agony. While victory was ultimately secured, it came at a staggering cost. The Thousand Sons alone lost 873 battle brothers from their storied 5th Fellowship, rendering this single combat group grouping all but extinct. The losses forced a rather painful decision upon Magnus the Red. The Legion, once organized into 10 fellowships, was restructured into the resurged, the 9 traditional divisions of Prosperan lore. This was a symbolic act, but also one of necessity, as the 5th Fellowship, once a proud pillar of the Legion's martial identity, ceased to be a functional and or even operational units. Banners from Kimeca Torica might have been soaked in victory, but there came a silence with said accomplishment, and the whispers continued as some began to question, had the powers that made the Thousand Sons so effective also ensured that they would never truly belong with the greater Imperium and continue to suffer such staggering losses. During the final century of the Great Crusade, the 28th Expeditionary Fleet of the Thousand Sons discovered a seemingly unremarkable star system, a cluster of lifeless planets orbiting a dying sun. But the 5th world, designated Argu, would become a subject of deep intrigue and later growing concern by the broader Imperium. Argu was home to a primitive, isolated human culture, intact yet untouched by advanced science or even any form of real industry. Despite their developed state, the local population willingly submitted to imperial control and were officially designated 2816. And this was achieved without bloodshed, as the compliance itself was a diplomatic success rather than anything greater. Yet it was what lay beneath the surface that drew the attention of Primarch Magnus the Red. The Argu people preserved histories of ancient beings called the Elohim, figures bearing a striking resemblance to what imperial soldiers might refer to as the Eldari. Within the tales, there was also mention of a corrupt being known as the Shithai, a dark hedonistic entity born from the Elohim's excess and imprisoned beneath the vast mountains at the edge of a salt flat valley. The structure itself was referred to by the Thousand Sons as the Mountain, and it dwarfed Olympus Mons back on Mars, along with, curiously enough, being an artificial construct. Surrounding the mountain, there were monolithic stones known as the Dead Stones, each towering higher than 3 men stacked upon each other. These ancient constructs were later confirmed to be psychic dampeners, placed there to suppress the warp energies radiating from the peak. Whether it was crafted by the Argu, the Elohim, or some other ancient race is theretofore unknown. Magnus, enthralled by the structure and its lore, entered the mountain and uncovered what would be described as a conceptual web, a gateway network of incomprehensible scale. Billions of potential conduits between worlds that spanned this hidden architecture. However, Argu's node had long since been corrupted by the warp and sealed from further access to attempt to contain the spread of chaos. It should have ended there, but fate seemed to have other plans. Captain Kofas of the 6th Fellowship, whose intent remains in great dispute, struck one of the Guardian constructs, which bore a particular similarity to Eldar Titans. The results were rather catastrophic, as the dormant forces within the mountain identified this action as potentially demonic in origin, and thanks to that, they were roused from their long slumber. The Titans, once inert, now moved with malice, and their attacks were both swift and brutal. In the chaos that followed, the Thousand Sons found themselves overwhelmed. Yet the tides would be turned with the unexpected arrival of the Space Wolves' 5th Great Company, led by Jarl Ashmodai Garson's son, returning from a campaign upon the Ark Cluster. Despite their initial tension, born from Magnus's irritation at the 6 legions' baroque demands, the 2 legions fought side by side unbelievably effectively. And thanks to this, the Titans were banished through a combination of strength and the might of both legions. In the aftermath, Magnus finally acknowledged the aid that the Space Wolves had provided them, offering the deference his son's cousins had earned in battle. And with the gate sealed once more, Magnus and his legion, bound for the broader Imperium, would suffer from the war erupting in the Ark Reach cluster. At the cusp of the 31st millennium, the Ark Reach cluster emerged as one of the most fiercely contested regions of the late Great Crusade. Discovered by the 47th Expeditionary Fleet of the Word Bearers, the Ark Reach cluster was a volatile convergence of binary stars and independent planetary empires. Each system in the cluster rejected the Imperium's offer of compliance, and what followed was not diplomacy, but fire and brimstone raining from the very skies. The initial phases of the compliance campaigns were swift and uncompromising. The first 4 systems fell beneath the relentless assault of the Word Bearers and the Space Wolves, 2 legions whose doctrines widely diverged, but whose shared sense of purpose made them a devastating duo of conquerors. Unleashed a campaign of utter and complete annihilation, the Word Bearers' Ashen Circle hunted down cultural relics and incinerated them, along with libraries, temples, and individuals with any scrap of knowledge that the Imperium would deem a false doctrine. The last 2 worlds, Arc Reach Secundus and its twin, the icebound world that would come to be known as Shrike, just refused to yield. On Secundus, high in the frozen peaks of Heliosa, the Avians held out within their silver towers. These formidable defenders, whose origins remain somewhat obscured within Imperial records, delayed the Crusade's completion and, most hurtful to the Space Wolves, triggered the call for reinforcement. That call was answered by Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons, who had recently departed from the compliance campaign at Argu, and it was Leman Russ himself who dispatched the summons. Despite the simmering tensions between the 6th and the 15th, Russ recognized that Heliosa's mysteries and Shrike's defenses required not force but intellect and guile, and that's where Magnus came in. However, this alliance would not be one of mutual understanding, as when the 1,000 Sons arrived, they found a campaign already in brutal motion. The Space Wolves had favored immediate, relentless strikes, maintaining momentum and unflinchingly keeping pressure upon their opponents. The 1,000 Sons, by contrast, preferred precision and psychic reconnaissance, along with strategic discretion. These doctrines seemed to clash and result in large amounts of animosity. However, none of this was more evident than on the bloody attrition upon Shrike, a world that earned its name from the skies. Imperial forces on Shrike had been relentlessly assaulted by flocks of hostile, razor-beaked avians, identified by the local population as snow shrikes. These predators tore through the exposed infantry, disrupted aerial deployment, and forced reconfiguration of Imperial arsenals towards point defense weaponry, constantly being aimed at the swarms in the very skies, rather than being implemented on battles against the planet's populace. What begun as a mission of compliance became a test of endurance, and for the 1,000 Sons, it would be a reckoning. It was on Shrike that the flesh change would return. Once thought dormant or even cured, the dreaded mutagenic curse erupted once more amongst the 15th Legion. Marines fell into uncontrollable mutations, their forms twisting beyond recognition, and in the midst of battle, they would be seen changing. To the Space Wolves, who had been long suspicious of their cousin's sorcery, this was a confirmation of their deepest fears and perhaps desires, as it allowed them to refer to the 1,000 Sons as impure, unclean, and damned. The final compliance of the Arc Reach cluster would be secured, but realistically at what cost, since at Heliosa's end, Russ would confront Magnus, and this would be because as the campaign across the Arc Reach cluster neared its conclusion, it was the 1,000 Sons who delivered the final precise stroke. At the Battle of Raven's Era 93, which was a key stronghold overlooking the ice-locked valleys of Shrike, which, much to the embarrassment of the Space Wolves, was won in a mere few hours, with extremely light casualties, all thanks to the 15th Legion's coordination and foresight, directed by the Corvidae cult, being what led the Imperial forces to have the ability to strike surgically. Through their presence, the hidden movements of the avian commanders were revealed and swiftly punished. Space Wolf strike teams executed the survivors in brutal close quarters combat, while Word Bearers fire teams cleansed the last holdout in holy flame. Victory, however, brought no unity, as tensions had been simmering and they reached their breaking point amidst the ruins of Phoenix Crag, Shrike's capital city. Here, Magnus the Red was appalled by what he saw: the burning of settlements and the execution of non-combatant civilians. To Magnus, this was no longer compliance. It was butchery of men, women, and children who had not been involved in any of the combat. However, to Leman Russ, what the Crimson King called a genocide, the Space Wolves merely saw as justice. The avians had defied the Imperial truth, clung to their beliefs, and due to their leadership and their combatants spilled Imperial blood. In Russ's eyes, their sentence had been passed the moment their leadership chose resistance. Then came the spark. As verbal barbs turned into open threats, several Fenrisian warriors broke ranks and charged. The 1,000 Sons, unwilling to be cowed, met force with sorcery, as bolts of psychic lightning lanced across the field. Fenrisian wolves were felled mid-pounce. Warriors of the 6th Legion collapsed, permanently crippled by nervous system failures induced through psychic precision. And then it happened. Amongst the 15th Legion stood Hustar, a Phione psyker of notable skill. In the chaos of battle, against what in all rights would be a traitorous assault from the Space Wolves, he overextended his power. The flesh change, long thought dormant, returned in full. His form twisted, bones ruptured, and his muscles ballooned grotesquely. Others nearby recoiled at the horror as his corruption began to trigger sympathetic mutations amongst the more psychically sensitive. Panic surged through the Thousand Sons ranks as Magnus the Red stepped forward, silent and wise. He approached Hustar without fear, arms wide in a gesture of mercy. The mutated Astartes, screaming and reached out to his gene sire. For a moment it appeared as if Magnus was about to embrace his broken son, and through said embrace hear him. And then a thunderclap emerged. A single round detonated within Hustar's chest, obliterating him in an instant. Then silence fell, followed by an echoing of a tink which was massive in the now quiet area. This was a spent shell casing which had been fired by the Wolf King. As Leman Russ strode forward without hesitation, his bolt gun still smoking. Weapons were drawn and sorcery crackled against chain blades and frost axes. Here the air grew thick and heavy with inevitability. But the bloodbath was not to come, at least not yet. This was due to the intervention of Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Wordbearers. As he stepped between them, his voice measured, commanding, and downright noble, cut through the fury. With rhetoric and orator skills honed like a blade, he quickly de-escalated what would have become the first full war between brother legions. Magnus, though calmed, refused to condone what had transpired in Heliosa. Russ, in turn, would not allow his judgment to be questioned. To him, his judgment was second only to the Emperor. This was his campaign, his discovery, and, by laws of conquest, his right to determine the fate of the people. The Avians had chosen death, in his view, and Russ was merely meant to deliver it. As he turned to depart, he faced his brother one last time. "There will be a reckoning between us," the Wolf King growled. With ritual finality, Russ drew his blade across his palm, letting his blood spill upon the frozen ground. He then cast his head back and howled, a cry that echoed across Shrike. His warriors answered in chorus, their howls rising like funeral dregs across the ash-lay sky. This was a warning, a promise, and a curse, all in one. It's important to recognize that the Great Crusade was not without its shadowed Machiavellian plot, along with moral strife, and perhaps none loomed larger than that of the crisis brought about by the Council of Nicaea. In the aftermath of the Heliosa campaign and the increasing public rift between the Thousand Sons and their brother legions, troubling accusations began. Captain Apophis of the 5th Fellowship, veteran of the Camineka Dorica campaign, would later recall the rising scrutiny being like a slowly tightening noose. The Thousand Sons had long since held a reputation for their arcane abilities, but now whispers hardened into charges. Mutation, heresy, dangerous consort with warp-born creatures. The most prominent of these voices came from the Death Guard, the Imperial Fist, the Raven Guard, and the Space Wolf, each harboring suspicions towards the very nature of sorcery and those who wielded it. Reports proliferated that the 15th Legion's gene seed had become unstable, that mutations were spreading unchecked, and that their powers, far from being tools of enlightenment, were gateways to corruption. Even those untainted by the flesh change were now demonstrating psychic abilities of tremendous and deeply concerning potency, what was making them appear as first among equals. As pressure mounted, these objections were carried to the Emperor. Amongst the most severe recommendations was the formal disbandment of the Thousand Sons and their erasure from imperial records. The Emperor, though rarely swayed by political fervor, had grown increasingly disturbed by Magnus's unrestrained pursuit of occult knowledge. The Imperium, as it advanced, encountered world after world devastated by the psychic wars of the Age of Strife. The scars left by uncontrolled psykers were still very much fresh to many a world, and visible within their cultures. The fear that such ruin could repeat itself, and this time at the hands of the Legionis Astartes, was not wholly unfounded. And so, at the edge of a fault line that could fracture the Imperium itself, the Emperor summoned a gathering of extraordinary weight, which would be known as the Council of Nicaea. Held on the isolated and seismically unstable world of Nicaea, the conclave brought together the highest authorities of the Imperium, while at least some of them, due to political brinksmanship, some primarchs, in particular those aligned with Magnus the Red's own belief, were unable to make it. But those who came included many a Primarch, senior commanders, administrators, scholars, even Malcador the Sigillite, regent and imperial proxy, who presided over the proceeding. At the center of the storm was Magnus the Red, who defended the use of psychic powers with unmatched eloquence. He spoke of progress, of insight, of unlocking the secrets of the universe to hasten the crusade. He argued that sorcery, properly harnessed, was not corruption, but rather salvation. His opposition was no less staunch. Leman Russ, still raw from the event of Heliosa, and his faithful denounced sorcery as antithetical to honor and loyalty, to the point of having one of their own befriend and beguile a Thousand Sons sorcerer and use the information and their friendship, fake as it was, to make the Thousand Sons Primarch look bad during the conclave. Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard, testified personally, invoking grim testimonies of his youth, in particular how warp manipulation had been the tool for the tyrant and Xenos warlords that had enslaved his entire population. As arguments raged, consensus began to crystallize, unfortunately for the galaxy at large, not around Magnus, but around fear of what psykers might become. However, rune priests and those psykers of the Space Wolves would be excluded from this, and so the Emperor rendered his judgment. No punishment would be levied for past transgressions. This was because unity demanded restraint, not retribution, as much as that upset Leman Russ. But effective immediately, the use of psychic powers by Imperial military forces would be prohibited. Astartes librarians were to be stood down and reintegrated into standard battlefield roles. Only astropaths, navigators, and strictly sanctioned psykers, such as those from the Ordo Sinister, who were under the direct Imperial control of either direct commands from the Emperor, such as the aforementioned Ordo Sinister, or those serving alongside the Sisters of Silence, would retain their position. To Magnus, this decree was more than a censure. It was a rejection of the future he believed in. The Thousand Sons complied outwardly, but inwardly they turned their energies insular. In secret, they began compiling all forbidden knowledge they could recover from thousands of compliant worlds. These fragments would later be bound into a single tome. Thus, the council ended not with a purge, but with a paper shield. This ruling meant to secure the Imperium's stability, but in truth, it marked a division that would echo for centuries to come, where a moment of mistrust was written into law, and where compliance bred quiet defiance. The events that would follow Magnus directly disregarding the Edict of Nicaea in an attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal would occur around 734 004 M31, and it would be known as the Fall of Prospero. But to others, it would be known as the Burning of Prospero, or even the Desolation of Prospero. As Prospero, the home of the 15th Legion, the Thousand Sons, had long stood as a jewel of intellect and psychic mastery, which had partly dimmed after the Emperor's decree at the Council of Nicaea. However, the Thousand Sons had not stopped their pursuit as they had delved deeper, even as they were ordered to look away, and in doing so, they drew the wrath of Terra. Officially, the Emperor had issued an order to recall the Legion, and to have Magnus and the Astartes taken into custody, and safely returned to Terra in disgrace. There, they would answer for their transgressions directly to him. But what followed was not sanctioned by the Emperor's hand. The blow that had struck Prospero was delivered by the Space Wolves all too willingly, having taken bluster and self-importance in their reputation as the Emperor's executioners. However, here they would not act under his order, but rather under Horus's, completely disregarding the direct commands of the God Emperor. The War Master, already deep in his treacherous designs, seized the opportunity to wedge brother against brother, as he dispatched the Space Wolves with falsified orders, some that would have been quite easy for them to see through if not blinded by their own enmity, ensuring that the Thousand Sons would be annihilated and not merely censured. With them came elements of the Legio Custodes and the silent enforcers of one of the greatest arms of military directly under the Emperor's command, the Sisters of Silence. Together they fell upon Prospero with an overwhelming force. The irony is impossible to ignore. The wolves, so often painted as brutal but loyal, seemed to not even deign questioning Horus's complete disregard of the Emperor's direct command. To them, it was the Emperor's will that they would be finally allowed to indulge in the destruction they so sought. And so they razed the shining towers of Zika and burned the soul of Prospero to ash. What they did, they believed was righteous and their nigh divinely ordained right. What they were, in the eyes of history, was deceived buffoon, clown, one of the many reasons the Horus heresy would go as horribly as it did. One of the titles given to them by the Black Legion was the Deceived. the term not regarding their foolishness, but rather how easy it was to manipulate them into betrayal of a loyal brother. It was an epitaph given to them not purely out of mockery, but of grim recognition of the failures the Space Wolves would forever be. Even Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns foresaw what was to come. He knew the implications of defying the Edict of Nicaea in an attempt to warn his father. He knew the price his legion might pay, and still he did not prepare for battle, as he chose inaction, believing perhaps that the judgment would be measured and deserved, or perhaps that resistance would only worsen the Emperor's wrath. It is unclear if he knew specifically what was coming and acted out of pride, guilt, or fatalism, but when the orbital bombardments began, there was no defenses prepared. The Space Wolves struck with relentless fury, orbital salvos leveling entire districts, targeting civilian populations, scholars, and warriors alike, all obliterated with a rapturous fervor that speaks more of the followers of Slaanesh. What followed the bombardment would be a drop pod assault, with a litany of descending Astartes, bringing fire, wrath, and brimstone, even that which could not fight. It was not a war, it was a purge, one which the Space Wolves would repeat with their allies on multiple occasions, marking this not as an isolated incident, but as a depiction of the Space Wolves' natural inclination. The final tragedy which would occur on that day would be a climactic battle between the two Primarchs on the shattered remnants of Prospero, where Leman Russ would meet Magnus the Red in single combat. There, amidst the flames of ruins, the Wolf King would seek to break the Cyclops, not only in body, but in spirit, as his sons attempted to slaughter every last remaining life on Prospero. However, what preceded the tragic event known as the Fall of Prospero did not begin with the battle itself, nor with the arrival of the Space Wolves, but rather it began with a rupture, a breach of trust, both personal and cosmic. When Magnus the Red first discovered the extent of Horus's betrayal, when he learned that his once loyal brother and war master had pledged himself to the ruinous powers of the warp, Magnus did not hesitate. With the full force of his psychic abilities, he reached out towards the only one he believed could stop the madness, the Emperor of Mankind. In an unprecedented act, Magnus initiated a psychic communication directly connecting with the Emperor's mind upon Terra, but the psychic backlash was immense, overwhelming the Imperium's already fragile defenses, as thousands of minds within the Imperial Palace would be shattered, their consciousnesses destroyed by the raw force of Magnus's message. However, the Emperor, deeply suspicious, was for some reason unwilling to accept the possibility of betrayal, and he refused to believe the warning, even though this might have been partly in rage due to Magnus destroying the psychic barriers he had set up in order to prevent demons from entering his webway project, which led to, in his eyes, Magnus, ever the obsessive sorcerer and psychic who had been tainted and betrayed him. The Emperor had long since been distrustful of his son's disregard for the rules and obsession with the use of psychic powers, which had not only been outlawed by the Council of Nicaea, but directly warned to Magnus by his father. To him, Magnus's current use of sorcery to destroy the webway project signaled corruption, and so the Emperor came to a grim conclusion. Magnus had been the one to turn to the Chaos God, or had been manipulated himself. In response, the Emperor issued a direct order. The Space Wolves, led by their Primarch Leman Russ, were to safely bring Magnus to Terra, where he would answer for his defiance, and the Emperor himself would deign what punishment Magnus would receive. However, what he could not have foreseen was that Horus, ever the architect of deception, had intercepted the Space Wolves and subtly told him of altered orders. These Space Wolves would no longer be tasked with retrieving Magnus and bringing him to Terra to face justice. Horus's orders had turned the retrieval and escort mission into something far darker, something that the Space Wolves were all too giddy to act upon. The Space Wolves were commanded to launch an assault on Prospero itself, the Thousand Suns homeworld. It was then that Magnus realized it was too late and that he had been deceived. His communication with the Emperor was indeed an act of loyalty, but it had been twisted by forces far beyond his control. In desperation, Magnus attempted to make amends, believing that in doing so, he could save the majority of his legion, if not himself, from the coming disaster. He deliberately withheld any warning from the Thousand Suns, unwilling to see his son's death as part of a greater design, even if it meant sacrificing everything he stood for. The Thousand Suns fleet was also dispatched far from the world intentionally, rendering it unable to join in the combat to defend the world, but also protecting all those upon it from the reprisal that Magnus and the world would be going through. Magnus understood the true enemy was not the Space Wolves themselves, but rather Chaos, having manipulated them both. However, he also understood that the Space Wolves would take any chance to slaughter him and his sons. The attack when it came was swift and merciless, as the Space Wolves were not only joined by the Adeptus Custodes, as well as the Sisters of Silence. They launched a brutal invasion when they arrived from the warp without warning, their fleet materializing almost directly above Prospero, catching the planet's defenders unprepared. With the planet's orbital defenses obliterated, there was no way to warn anyone, and no form of preparation, just a violent, relentless assault on an army that did not know the truth of their own betrayal. The Emperor had not ordered retribution, he had ordered censure, and for the Thousand Suns to be escorted to Terra. But it was Horus, counting on the Space Wolf's eagerness, working with his cunning, guile, and manipulation, who had set the stage for Prospero's destruction. The result was not simply the fall of a planet, but the rupture of the Imperium's very fabric, and the setting of a trend that the Space Wolves would seemingly follow for millennia to come. The fate of Prospero itself was definitively sealed in a violent, decisive moment. Following the devastating orbital bombardment, which reduced much of the world to ash, Zika, the capital city and seat of Magnus the Red and his Thousand Sons Legion, stood as the last bastion of defiance and the last safe place for non-combatants. Despite the destruction on the planet's surface, Zika itself remained largely intact, shielded by a nigh impenetrable psychic void shield that protected the city from the wrath of Imperial firepower. This formidable shield was maintained by one of the Thousand Sons' secretive cults, and Magnus, though fully aware of the approaching doom, did not dare disable it. To do so would alert his legion and invite the inevitable destruction of every last living being on Prospero. Magnus knew that with the shield in place, any Imperial invasion on Zika would be costly, and indeed, this proved to be the case. When the Space Wolves, along with their allies, the Adeptus Custodes and the legendary Sisters of Silence, arrived, they faced a formidable challenge, that of breaching Zika's defenses. A vast Imperial force descended from the skies, with landing craft and support vehicles flooding the city. Though they found the city's defenses mostly unarmed, the Imperial invaders swiftly established a breach within the spaceport area, and they did so with brutal efficiency, beginning their slaughter of the Prosperans, indiscriminately razing everything. However, the rank and file of the Thousand Sons, unlike their Primarch, did not accept their fate willingly. They did not see their inevitable defeat as a necessary punishment for the defiance of Magnus's wishes, and in defiance of Magnus's wishes, they rose up, defended their city and the citizens within. Surprisingly enough, they managed to hold their ground against the three factions of invaders, their sorcery and unrelenting will keeping the Space Wolves at bay. Zika, the last surviving city on Prospero, became a morbid battleground and a symbol of the Legion's desperate resistance. But as the battle wore on, Magnus could no longer stand idly by. He had seen the signs of his Legion's downfall, and reluctantly, he understood that this was no longer a punishment, but rather an execution. That moment came when Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, and his wolf-born monstrosities, the cursed and mutated sons of Fenris, were brought into the heart of Zika. They advanced towards the last standing pyramid of the city. This would be the site of the confrontation between two of the greatest and most powerful Primarchs. It was there that Magnus and Russ would engage in battle, and so would begin a battle of epic proportions.